welcome to the pod, Nancy. I'm excited to have you here.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, okay, so I have to thank you for a couple different reasons. First, I don't know that I ever would have watched The Devil Wears Prada had we not been doing. I mean, here I am, famous T-shirt connoisseur. It was a movie I wanted to get on at some point in time because I felt like it was important to talk about, but it wasn't high on my list.
Got it.
Even though I find myself looking more and more at far more expensive jackets for the fall here in Colorado.
Okay, yeah.
And then I also got to read your book, which I have 2 copies of. So they sent me an advanced reader copy.
You have the galley, okay.
Early on. Yes, it was cool. And then the other day, I wasn't expecting it. I got the hardback version.
Oh, you got the nice version. Yeah, you got the fashion version.
I got the bougie version, yes. Yeah. So I'm actually, and I traditionally try to give away some of these books from time to time, but I really don't want to with yours because as I was you know this because you already wrote it, but as I was reading it, I kept feeling like I was reading some kind of spy novel or something like that. This book goes so many cool places. It was just, I'm so glad I read it. So I'm so excited to talk to you today.
That's such a nice thing to hear.
No, are you kidding me? I want people to read this book because it's really, really cool. So we're going to talk about this book, Empresses of Seventh Avenue, World War II, New York City, and the birth of American fashion. We'll talk about this movie today, Devil Wears Prada. We'll talk about you a little bit. We'll talk about all kinds of stuff. Before we jump in, do you want to introduce yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm Nancy MacDonell. I'm a fashion journalist as well as a fashion historian. I was a fashion journalist first. I've been writing about fashion since let's say the second half of the 90s. I'm definitely Gen X. And I've written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Elle, Harper's Bazaar, quite a few publications. As you may have noticed, the bottom sort of fell out of journalism, especially magazine journalism, in the mid-2000s. And I decided to indulge my what had a long-standing interest in not just fashion, but fashion history. I've always been interested in what people wear, but also what people used to wear. Even as a kid, I found old photos fascinating, old films. I just really loved them. So I went back to school for a master's degree number 2 and studied fashion and textile studies at FIT, where I now teach. I now teach in the program that I once studied in.
That is very cool. All right. Well, that's what I'm assuming just drove you into writing the book, which I am I'm so happy to see this in-depth study because you're talking in this book about, focusing on women and telling us about this is a story that we haven't seen before and women get often overlooked in these conversations. And as someone who's kind of new to fashion and trying to understand, the directions of fashion, I felt a bit like Anne Hathaway at the beginning of this film where I'm like, yeah, I'm very, can't you tell? At the same time, I find fashion incredibly compelling, which sounds weird because I'm wearing a t-shirt and cargo shorts right now. But this is such a cool book, and this is such a cool story, and I really want to dig into these ideas about what fashion is and what fashion means, and and the labor and the challenges these women performed and went through. I just find these stories incredibly compelling. So I'm so happy that you're here. I guess maybe let's start with this idea. We've got this book's title is awesome. If you don't buy this book immediately, I'm just on the title alone. But I'll say it again, Empresses of Seventh Avenue. It's just so cool. How did you come up with the idea for writing this particular book? What was the genesis behind writing the story?
Writing this book. It's a period of fashion history and history that that really interests me. The period between the wars. In terms of fashion, it was a real high mark for women designers. The 3 top designers in this era were Madeleine Vionnet, Elsa Schiaparelli, and Gabrielle Coco Chanel. They absolutely dominated fashion. In fact, another designer, I believe it was Jean Patou, gave an interview in which he said something like, just because I'm a man doesn't mean I'm not a good designer. So it was really an era of women dominating the industry. So that was very interesting to me because I've I love hearing everyone's stories, but I especially love telling women's stories, especially historically, because uh, it's not something that we've traditionally known as much about. And I wanted to tell the story of American fashion, which really interests me because it's really rooted in democracy, unlike French fashion. And we can dig into all of the differences between Paris and New York. I know you
Oh,
want to
yes.
talk about that. Um, and when people talk about fashion history or think of fashion history, they tend to focus on the designers, who are absolutely very important, but they could not get their ideas out there without a lot of other people supporting them, and that includes press, that includes retailers, that includes publicists. So I wanted to include all of this, and I knew about all these women separately. But it was a bit of a light bulb moment when I thought, well, they all knew each other. Of course they did, because they're in fashion is a small world now, but it was even smaller in the 1930s. And I realized that it would be, or I thought it would be really interesting to weave their stories together to create this. It was like the foundation for telling a bigger story.
How do you so when you identified this idea of of this interwar story and the idea to tell the story behind women, how do you go about writing this or researching this and writing it? You were familiar with all of these women, you had
Mm.
known of them and so forth, and then I'm looking through your index and your bibliography, and it's like, I don't know, this thick or so.
My publisher
Um,
was a little taken aback.
you
Yeah,
did work on this, like
yeah.
real. I mean, all historians do, right? But I mean, what was the process like of like formulating these questions and then looking for archives and trying to find these answers and tease out these stories?
Yeah. Well, luckily for me, the primary sources are fashion magazines. It's no hardship to have to read Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. I think I might have read every issue of WWD, Women's Wear Daily, which is the daily newspaper of the fashion industry from about 1930 through 1947. I could have done this forever, honestly, just reading these old magazines. I mean, I'm a fashion journalist. I love old fashioned journalism as well. And I was really lucky in that quite a few of these women wrote memoirs. Maybe it was just a more literate era. They didn't have, their Instagram accounts or whatnot, but when they retired, they wrote about their life in fashion. The editor of Vogue wrote one, the editor of Harper's Bazaar, another Vogue editor, Bettina Ballard, wrote a wonderful book called In My Fashion, where she talks about everybody in the industry. Like, the gloves come off. She has nothing to lose at this point. So all those were fascinating. And also, Elizabeth Hawes, one of the designers that I wrote about 6 books. So she was very helpful as well. So the research was really fun. I mean, I could still be researching it now if I didn't have a deadline that I needed to get my manuscript in by.
No, and I tell you, like, so I have this long-standing affair. We're talking about Devil Wears Prada today, but
Hmm.
I was just watching L.A. Confidential recently.
Oh,
It's
yeah, yeah.
one of my favorite films.
It's a
I
great film.
tweeted it at Derek Guy the other day. It's like, hey, what's up? How do I dress like that turn of the war
Hmm.
set? That post-war era for me, like for men's fashion, I adore. And of course, Mad Men came out a few years ago
Yeah.
and focused on a
Hmm.
different era, but I can't help but to be drawn to this era. Is
Mm-hmm.
this the height of American fashion? What is this? What is this era for Americans, and I guess American fashion in the world?
Yeah. Well, it was when there were a lot of rules in fashion and everyone knew them and people pretty much followed them. This starts to break down, as so many things did, in the 1960s, when people they just didn't want to bother with that. They wanted to dress more casually. They wanted to be more comfortable. It was like the baby boomers wanted to wear their play clothes all the time instead of being dressed up in their school clothes. They wanted to come home and put on their play clothes, and that's what they wanted to wear. So all of those rules go out the window. Men stop wearing hats, women stop wearing hats, all kinds of things. We've really streamlined. So is it a high point? I guess it depends what you like in fashion. After the war, as you know, the United States had a much bigger place on the world stage, and not just politically, but culturally. Art, culture, and this included fashion. So yeah, it kind of was a high point for American design.
Listen, all I'm wanting you to tell me is that at some point in time, I'm going to be able to wear a fedora again.
Unironically, I don't know. I can't promise that.
I've tried. I go and I'm like, I
Mm.
look like the dime store Indiana Jones. Like that's not going to work. I cannot pull it off. And I want so desperately the hats
It's
to come
hard.
back.
Yeah, hats are. I mean, there was a time when if you appeared in public without a hat, people would think you'd maybe been in an accident. Like, what happened that you had to leave so quickly that you didn't have your hat on?
It was a dedicated piece of American clothing.
For everyone,
So
and gloves. People
really,
wear gloves all the time, but yeah, not anymore.
well, you're telling me like the boomers wanted to wear play clothes all the time. So I'm just writing this down as yet another thing that generation ruined for us, as especially since I'm the tail end of Gen X. I'm just
Uh-huh.
holding on. I was born in
Mhm.
'77, so I feel like a bit of a fraud because I'm such a baby X, but I'm still there.
Mhm. You're Gen X.
No,
You're Gen X. Yeah.
I'm holding on. I'm not slipping. All right, so we were talking about how to pair your book with the film. We talked about a couple different things. Ultimately, we
Mhm.
settled
Mhm.
on Devil Wears Prada. I think in some ways maybe because it's obviously the spirit of Anna Wintour is just all over this film,
Yeah.
but I think it's maybe the most overt fashion film recently. I don't know. When you
Yeah.
think about this movie, what are your thoughts? What are your general opinions of this film when you were thinking about it?
Well, first of all, the title is fantastic. I mean, it's
It
just a
is.
wonderful title that's going to draw you in whether you know about fashion or not. If you do know about fashion, then you can really read into the codes of it because it's a masterful use of branding. Um, Prada, the label Prada, is considered like a very intellectual, rigorous kind of label by fashion people. Mucha Prada, Mrs. Prada, as she's always known in the industry. She has a PhD in political science. She's not just interested in making sexy, sexy clothes. She always has ideas that she's putting through in her collections. So, Prada often has like awkward colors, unwieldy proportions. It had this whole ugly chic, ugly shoe era that in the 90s that people were all over. So it's a real fashion person brand. It's like anybody could wear Chanel, anyone could wear Versace, but it's a fashion person who wears Prada. So the title, The Devil Wears Prada, if you're a fashion person, that tells you a lot. Um, and yes, the idea that Miranda Priestley, the villain, is based on Anna Wintour. The book that the film was based on was written by one of Anna's assistants. She always has three assistants. One of them, Lauren Weisberger, I think her name was, wrote the book that the film was based on. Although they diverge, the film and the book are not that similar.
I wonder maybe if we could backtrack just for a second and maybe talk a little bit about the idea of where fashion comes from and
Mm-hmm,
how it's
mm-hmm.
influencing the basic society. There's that great line that Miranda gives in the film
The
about
cerulean
cerulean.
blue, yeah.
Blew me away. I sat there as like because I'm feeling a bit like and then she does this thing, and Streep's delivery in this film is so low. I
It's
was
you
not
know where she
expecting that.
got that? Clint
No, tell
Eastwood.
me.
Yeah,
Are you
apparently she got that from
serious?
Clint Eastwood. She said he speaks very softly, so you
Mhm.
have to lean in to listen, and it makes him the most important person in the room.
She draws you. I mean, she's the greatest actress of her time, but
Yes, that they
you
got her to
know,
play Miranda was that made the film. It was. She's a serious actress in a film about fashion, which most people dismiss as being just silly. So I think it's very important that she played Miranda. But
I
fashion.
was
Okay,
doing.
so what's fashion come from? Well, let's define fashion. So
Okay.
fashion is the standard of elegance of an era, whatever that means in that particular era. And crucially, it changes for the sake of change. And the orthodox view is that fashion begins sometime in the late Middle Ages, very early Renaissance, because to have fashion, you need two things. You need a middle class with a disposable income, and you need urban centers, right? Because if just you're wearing it and the other people who live in your castle, it's not fashion. It needs to be more widespread than that. So when you have urban centers, you can get fashion. If you're anti-urban, you're probably also anti-fashion, I think. Um, so I like to quote the art historian Anne Hollander. She said that fashion is the art form that we all participate in. And I think that's really true. People talk about fashion sometimes in terms of practicality and staying warm. Yes, but I think that the eye looks for beauty. And fashion is a way that we can show that. We can look for it in other people. We can appreciate it. Some cultures have more respect for beauty and that's called the beautiful presentation of the self than others do. What my European colleagues might call Anglo-Saxon countries, fashion tends to be looked down on as something frivolous. It's feminine, it's silly, but you can tell a lot about a society by its fashions. Like if all you saw of, say, the Victorian era were the clothes, you would know straight away that this was a society that had really stratified gender roles. Like the women dress one way, the men dress another way, and there's nothing, never the twain shall meet.
I'm wondering now the role of Seventh Avenue. We talk about this. You talk about this in the
Seventh
book.
Avenue,
Can we talk a little bit about where does this come from? What specifically? When we talk about the Empresses of Seventh Avenue.
Seventh Avenue, yeah.
Where is this?
Avenue.
Where and what is this place?
It's in Manhattan. Seventh Avenue was traditionally the center of the American garment industry. And the garment district runs from the high 20s, low 30s up to about maybe 42nd Street. It runs from Broadway over to 9th Avenue. It's about a square mile of Manhattan. At the time that most of the action in the book is taking place, there were about 5,000 firms in this square mile of Manhattan, making about 80% of the clothes that Americans wore. I don't just mean designing. I mean they were sewing them, they were cutting them. That's where clothes were made. There were other regional centers like St. Louis, which was really known for juniors, like teenage girl fashion. Mm-hmm. Los Angeles was another center. But Manhattan was the center, and it was known as a shorthand, Seventh Avenue, by this thoroughfare that cuts through it. So that's what Seventh Avenue is. It really designates ready to wear, not made to order fashion.
All right, I want to go back to Wintour. We talked about her mm-hmm. just a second ago. Mm-hmm. She's not the central character, but everything moves around her in mm-hmm. this film, all the way back to the title. Yeah. Can we talk about who she is and why of all people, like she gets this, I don't know, expose written about her, or mm-hmm. And then later a film, and I think there's a sequel coming now as well.
Yes, I've just heard about the sequel, which of course I'm dying to see. I really hope they make it.
I'm all in at this point because I watched this film. I loved it. I was watching this movie 2 nights ago, just mm-hmm. all in. Can we talk about who she is specifically, and maybe the differences between say her and Miranda sure. Priestley, are the character?
So Anna Wintour is the editor-in-chief of Vogue, except she's not just the editor-in-chief of Vogue. She is the editorial director for all of Condé Nast, which is the parent company of Vogue. In the film, I think it's called Elias Clark. Mm-hmm. Elias Clark. It's Condé Nast. She's the most powerful woman in fashion. She has a very distinct look, which she has been cultivating since she was about 14. She has a bob haircut. She's had that since she was 14. She's very slender. She always dresses in a particular way. She wears a sort of mid-calf dress from a series of designers, including Prada. She always wears Manolo Blahnik shoes. She always has her sunglasses in place. And I've never seen her carry a handbag. She's too powerful for that. You know that she's got a car and a driver waiting for her. She doesn't need to carry anything more than her phone. And she's a person with a lot of mystique around her, as powerful women often do have. I think people paint her they're very critical of her. And I don't think she would get the same criticism if she was a man, which is the thing you always hear about Anna Wintour. She knows what she wants. She works very hard and she expects the same from her staff. And she doesn't feel, I think Meryl Streep actually spoke about this, the Miranda character, and I think Anna Wintour is the same. She doesn't feel the need to ingratiate herself with people, which is how women tend to be socialized to be. And I think that's off-putting for a lot of people. But Miranda is, though she has some similarities with Anna, I noticed that they really went out of the way to visually separate her from Anna Wintour. They look nothing like. Miranda Priestley has white hair, which was a brave choice because women are often criticized for letting their hair go white or go gray. She doesn't dress in the same way that Anna Wintour dresses. She dresses, I think of her fashion as kind of rich lady fashion. It's not about a particular era or a particular designer. It's these silhouettes that really suit her in very expensive fabrics. That is her look.
Are they mostly so? Are the similarities then just in her personality, in how she treats folks, or like this? Everyone says, "Oh, this is obviously based on Wintour."
Yeah.
Where is that coming from then, as far as this Priestley character?
Yeah,
is it just her relationship towards her secretary? Or assistants?
One of her assistants wrote it, yeah. When the book came out, I remember no one in fashion wanted to review it or feature it. There was this idea that you don't want to upset Anna. And there are very few actual fashion people in the film. Apparently, quite a few were approached, and they said, "Oh no, I couldn't do that. No. I don't want to get Anna upset." But she's a kingmaker. If they're looking for a new creative director at Dior, they're going to ask Anna Wintour what her opinion is. She has this power to put people into positions in fashion, to promote particular designers. And she's taken Vogue way beyond just being a magazine. It's a huge brand now. For example, the Met Gala. It's like fashion's Olympics or fashion's Comic-Con. Maybe that's a better way to describe it, because people always dress around this theme.
You just opened up a whole new audience into the pod now at this point in time. The Dungeons and Dragons people just went, "Wait, what? What am I wearing this fall?" So,
yeah, watch the coverage of the Met Gala.
Yeah. What happens with Wintour as far as how does she amass this power? I mean, she's clearly a hyper intelligent woman. She's driven. Does she just come from out of nowhere? Where does she come from, and how does she get to her position of stature? Because, in the book you talk about this, but women have some real challenges to overcome in this industry.
Yeah. So Anna Wintour was born in London. Her father is British and her mother was an American. Her father was actually a newspaper editor. He was the editor of the Evening Standard, which was a major London paper. So she was really hearing about journalism from the time she was quite small. And she has said that really this is what my father wanted me to do. He set me on this path. So when she was a teenager, this is swinging London. She worked at Biba, which was like the coolest store of the era. She did not go to university. She started working in fashion magazines straight away. And she just worked harder than anybody else. She does not suffer fools gladly. She worked her way up to becoming editor-in-chief. First, she was editor-in-chief of British Vogue. But she has herself said that the British market she didn't understand it as well as she understood the American market. And American Vogue is the jewel in the crown. That is what you want. She came there. It was the 80s. She's been the editor-in-chief of Vogue since 1987. I want to say quite a long time.
Wow.
Yeah, she was in her late 30s at the time, and she's well into her 70s now. And she got along very well with Alexander Lieberman, who was the powerful art director of Vogue. He shows up in the book because he's been working since the 1940s as well. So he'd been around for a long time. And she had his ear, and also the ear of Cy Newhouse, who bought Condé Nast. Condé Nast was a person who named the company after himself. So he bought the company Condé Nast and Vogue. And at the time, in the 1990s, fashion was just it was really becoming part of popular culture. She really understood that moment. And she opened up the magazine to a whole new readership. She knows what she's doing. She's kept Vogue relevant all of these years, and that's not easy to do for a magazine.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk, and you talk about this in the book, so I really want to go back to these Vogue battles, and so forth. But before we do that, I want to actually ask you about some of maybe her predecessors, which in the industry and so forth. So you're talking about the role of women in building this American fashion industry after the war. can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the women we should know?
We should know
You don't have
about?
to give away the
Sure.
entire book. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, totally. And like what they go through, what are their challenges, and how do they build this fashion industry that ultimately
Yeah.
say women like Wintour rise to the top of?
Yeah. The thing about fashion that the one thing I find very interesting is that it was a field in which women could excel and could reach positions of power. By 1940, I think something like 84% of women in the United States who were executives were fashion executives, whether that was in publishing or in a retailer. It was an area where women could really build careers. Um, which I think it was unusual at the time. It was not. It would have been much more difficult to go take over. I don't know, to get into car manufacturing or something. That was not an area in
Sure.
which women were welcome. And part of it was, sexist stereotyping. This is about shopping, and women really know about that, so that's really good. But they used that to advance themselves. So some of the women that I feel like have been so unfairly forgotten. Well, we can start with Elizabeth Hawes, who was a very interesting person. She was born in 1903. She became a designer. She was born in 1903, and unusually, her mother had a university degree. She was Vassar class of 1891. So already that made her family somewhat unusual. And her mother encouraged all of her children to be creative. She was a very early supporter of Montessori education in the United States. So by the time she was in middle school, Elizabeth Hawes had a dress business that she was running. Then she went to Vassar herself. She studied economics, and she wrote her thesis on Ramsay MacDonald, the British Labour politician who became Prime Minister of Great Britain. But she also loved fashion, and she was the person who coined the term the French legend, which is very key to the book. So this is the French legend. She said the French legend is that all beautiful clothes are made in the atelier of French designers, and all women want them. This had existed for a long time. She just put a name on it. And when she was young, she was a firm believer in the French legend. She went to Paris to learn how to design beautiful clothes, and she became completely disillusioned with the fashion industry and with the French legend. And she wrote a book about it called Fashion Spinach, a fantastic book. The title comes from a New Yorker cartoon of the era, which was very well known. And it shows a mother and child sitting at the dinner table, and the mother says, "Eat your broccoli, dear." And the kid says, "I say it's spinach," and I say, "To hell with it." So what she was saying was fashion is always trying to sell women something they don't really want and telling them that they do want it. She said that French designers didn't know anything about designing for American women. The way the industry worked at the time, I'm not sure if we have really gotten drilled down into this yet, but that American designers just copied Paris designers. They were not encouraged to have original ideas. Paris was the only global fashion city. New York was a manufacturing center. No one wanted to know anything about American designers and their original ideas. Elizabeth Hawes says that's ridiculous. We need our own legend. We need to design here. She subsequently ended up closing her design house. She became a labor organizer of all things, and she ended up being blacklisted by the FBI, which is probably one of the reasons that we don't know so much about her. They conflated her with another Elizabeth Hawes, Elizabeth Day Hawes, who also went to Vassar, who was a labor organizer in the Southern textile mills, which were notoriously union resistant. So Elizabeth Hawes did have leftist leanings, but how they thought she could be running a haute couture salon in New York and also organizing laborers in Alabama, I don't know. But that's what happened to her. And then Lois Long, who's very close to my heart because she was a fashion journalist. She was the fashion critic for The New Yorker. She joined the magazine in 1925, the year that it began. And she's this kind of Zelda Fitzgerald character at The New Yorker. She was hired because one of her colleagues said she could have posed for Miss Jazz Age. You know, she has this little dark bob. She dressed in the latest styles. And her first job at The New Yorker was not writing about fashion. She was the nightclub reviewer. This is during Prohibition. So she's going out every night to illegal nightclubs and writing about them for the New Yorker. And she made them all sound like, these screwball comedies as to what happens to her in these places. And then she went on to become, as her editor, William Shawn said, she invented fashion criticism. She didn't just tell people this is what you should wear. She really analyzed clothes. And she's a very funny, incredible writer. She stayed at the New Yorker till 1970. Unfairly forgotten. We definitely need to remember her. And Eleanor Lambert, who was the original Empress of Seventh Avenue, that was her nickname. I just kind of turned it into a general name for all of these women. You cannot talk about the history of American fashion without talking about Eleanor Lambert. She was a fashion publicist, but she really invented this profession of fashion publicist. And she's the person who started the Met Gala, although it wasn't called that back then. It was called the Party of the Year. She came up with the idea for New York Fashion Week. She founded the CFDA, which is like the Professional Association of American Designers. She really was the Empress of Seventh Avenue. She was quite incredible. And she worked until, get this, she was 99 years old.
Was she a Supreme Court justice too? I mean, I want to ask you, for a book about women and their role in fashion, I want to ask you about this. As a man, is fashion exclusively feminine? When I think about fashion, certainly there's some men I think about, Yves Saint Laurent and so forth, and I'm an infant when it comes to this. So I'm kind of wondering, what's the differences between, say, men and women in fashion? It's certainly in the time period you're talking about. Is there a masculinity to fashion? Is it socially acceptable for men to be questioning or to be thinking about what they're wearing and how they're being perceived? Like, what are the fellas going through at this point in time?
Okay, well, I think the American view is that no, men should not care about fashion because that's a silly girl thing. Historically, that has not been true. Prior to the late 18th century, men wore silk and bright colors and embroidery and lace and all the rest of it. And then we get what is called the Great Masculine Renunciation. When men in the West, they give up bright colors, they give up tricky silhouettes, and they basically start wearing the suit. Not that different from suits are today. The term was coined by the Anglo-German psychologist John Flugel in 1930. But in terms of women's fashion, men have always been involved. The first couturier was a man, Charles Frederick Worth, and he set the template for this is what an haute couture collection is, and this is what a designer is like. I don't talk about men's fashion in the book so much because it didn't go through the same story that women's fashion did. Men wore suits. If you could afford it, you went to your tailor and he made you a suit. If you couldn't afford that, you went to the store and you bought a ready-made suit. And men's fashion changes in like tiny little increments. It doesn't have, in that sense, it's more modern than women's fashion because men don't have to change things all the time. And the most forward-looking women's wear designers like Chanel took a lot of their ideas from menswear. And as women's fashion becomes more modern, it comes to resemble men's fashion more. It takes more ideas from men's fashion.
Now you got me thinking about these shoulder pads that were in the 1980s. I remember as a child, even I was like, "What? Oh, I don't understand why this is here." Everyone looks like a linebacker right now. Yeah. I want to ask you about so much of this film is obviously based on Runway, which is a stand-in for Vogue. Mm-hmm. Can we talk about the role of publications and magazines and how they are affecting what happens and how people are perceiving fashion as well?
Right. Well, in this era, the era that the book is covering, designers could not communicate directly with their customers the way they can now. We'll get to that. Right. So they needed a middle person, and that was the fashion magazine. They would decide, they would make this pilgrimage to Paris, probably 3 or 4 times a year. They would go to the designer collections. They would select the looks that they thought would play well back in the United States. They would photograph them. They would write about them. They would promote designers that they liked in this way. So American editors, rather, were always being courted by the couturiers because everyone wanted the American market. It's huge. Of course, people want to sell their clothes there. But they were the ones who interpreted fashion for American women. Also, retailers did this. Retailers were, in those days, when you could not shop online, when you had to go to the department store or a boutique or whatever, they really educated their salespeople about different fashions, about, this is why this look is happening now. They offered all kinds of alterations. It was really a place where you could go have an experience and learn about fashion and also buy it. So working hand in hand, really, the retailers and the magazines showed women what was fashionable, because you couldn't go to a website and look at every Louis Vuitton look from spring 2023. There was no way of doing that. It was interpreted for you, and it happened months later. It didn't, happen exactly then. Several months down the line, you would see the clothes.
What's happening now as magazines have changed and so forth? We've gotten to the era. There was no social media, or I guess magazines were the social media of its time. It's probably best.
When I went back to rewatch The Devil Wears Prada, it was so nostalgic for me because I was working in magazines then. But it's all about this physical product. They're talking about paper. At the end of the day, when Andy or Emily have to bring the book to Miranda. This really happened. This originated with Diana Vreeland, who was editor-in-chief of Vogue in the 1960s. She would have her assistants bring her the book I think in the morning, not in the evening. And it was this facsimile of the magazine. One of her assistants was Ali McGraw. And she wrote later about going into this grand apartment building that Diana Vreeland lived in and standing in her foyer. And she remembered the smell of porridge, which is what she had for breakfast every morning, and expensive soap and candles. And it was this whole experience for her to drop off the book that Vreeland would then look at and, go through with her red marker or red pencil. Now, no, social media has taken so much of that power away from fashion magazines. The type of fashion editor that used to exist that could make a trend, that job just doesn't exist anymore. Because, with social media, brands can go directly to their consumer. They can also go to, influencers who are not trained journalists usually. And there are just so many more ways of getting that information out there. So no, magazines don't have that same authority anymore at all.
Are magazines then, or these companies, are they chasing influencers? Is that what's happening? Are people building their own style? I wonder, how is this being marketed now, or how magazines are adapting to this?
Remember when Kanye and Kim Kardashian were on the cover of Vogue? You might not, but they were on the cover of Vogue.
I've tried to forget, but yes, yes. So
yeah, that was such a turning point for me. Yeah, I think they need them, but it's not. Yeah, it's not the fashion magazine of the past. I think they're scrambling to reinvent themselves. They're a lot about shopping now. Like if you look at Vogue's website every day, there are constant stories about the 10 things under $300 or, whatever it is. And then there are affiliate links that I assume they must make some income from. But no, they can't just rely on, publishing stories that are 3 months old. The way they used to.
So you bring up Kim and Kanye, then it brings up a question I started to think as you were talking about, which is the racial components of fashion post-war, right? And I'm trying to think about, like, are these audiences are they targeting exclusively white audiences? Like, watching this film, it didn't hit me till afterwards. It's like, there's not a lot of people of color in this movie.
There really aren't.
So
no,
it didn't hit me till later. It's like, no. So
yeah,
what's going on racially? Is fashion changes at some point in time? Do the Vogues of the world start to pivot towards other audiences, or have they always been like? Is there a racial dynamic to fashion post-war?
Not always. Certainly not always.
Okay.
If you look through an old fashion magazine, it is unusual, very unusual, to find a person of color. One of the few that I do remember seeing from magazines of the 1940s is a ballerina named Sono Osato, who was half Japanese. And even though, this was during World War II, the United States is at war with Japan, she still is being photographed. There was a whole love affair between fashion magazines and the ballet at that time. And she's frequently photographed. But she's unusual. It takes a long time for a woman of color to appear in one of the glossy magazines. It is 1966, I believe, but when a model named Daniela Luna makes the cover of British Harper's Bazaar. It's not till the 1970s until a model named Beverly Johnson, who is Black, makes the cover of American Vogue. So this takes a really long time. The film came out in 2006, I think, The Devil Wears Prada. I don't even think anyone at the time who worked in the fashion industry would have really even considered that. It was just the way it was. Things have certainly changed for the better, I would say. Absolutely for the better. And you see much more representation of people of color, also of different body types. That's really been a big change. Even brands sometimes now will photograph their looks on various different models. They'll tell you what size each one wears, and it's not always a size 0. There is not nearly enough of this as there should be. This conversation comes up every fashion week, like how many models of color were walked in New York and how many walked in Paris. And it's not like it's on an upward path. It goes up and down, and it's always a low percentage. I don't want to quote a number because I can't remember off the top of my head, but it does not reflect the reality of the United States in 2024.
Sure. You actually brought to think, you said this just a second ago, and it flashed back to I was looking at ordering some clothes or looking at something recently. And it was like, this guy is 6 foot tall and wears a medium shirt, and I'm 6'1" and I wear double X. I'm like, how does a medium man at my height exist? But I was thankful for that because the Hugh Jackmans as Wolverine don't exist on a day-to-day basis. We're starting to see this more and more, which is, hey, even on social media where people are coming out and say, hey, these body types are not attainable day in, day out.
They're unrealistic.
Be able to recognize this. Right. But I also remember in the 1990s, I remember, the Kate Mosses of the world. And I even remember maybe even the time period, these challenges to those waifish look. And were magazines and wrestling with this at this point in time, because I seem to remember there was a connection between what people were seeing on the page and then body dysmorphia, things like that. Was there ever a blowback within the fashion industry about this, or did fashion industries try to grapple with this? What happens with that?
Are you talking about the 90s now and the wave?
Sure, yeah. Oh, we're Gen X. We got to talk about the 90s at some point in time.
Well, Kate Moss was a real disruptor. The models who had big names before her were the original supermodels. And they were tall and statuesque and much, I don't want to say they were curvy, but much more womanly than models that you see now. And then you get Kate Moss, who is very short for a model. She's like maybe 5'6" or 5'7". And she's really small. And it was really... it got labeled heroin chic. She posed for those Calvin Klein ads and people would scroll "feed me" on the ads. She was very young at the time. She was maybe 15. That was her size, but it was still unrealistic to a lot of women. I think what you need to remember about models is they are teenagers. They're really, really young. And they won't have that body type forever. They're like 5'10" or 5'11", and they're really small, but they're teenagers. They have not grown into their mature bodies yet. I think people don't realize that. In the 1940s and 30s, models were a lot older. They were in their 20s or 30s. It was a different era. They were slender, certainly, but they didn't have that incredible disconnect that models do now.
And again, that's maybe the pressure that social media puts onto us, which is when you look in there and everyone's beautiful, everyone's in shape, or you've got whatever, and the clothes look terrific on them, and you think, oh God, and then you start to get down on yourself. It could be a real. I remember when I was teaching high school, and we would do this review with the students at the end of every year. We would talk to them about, like, hey, what are the biggest challenges to your life? And they would say, without a doubt, it was always the way they appeared on social media
Oh,
because
wow.
of conflict. I love my kid. I loved those kids, still do.
Mm-hmm.
But broke my heart when I would hear
Yeah.
them talk about how they
Yeah.
felt like they had to look a certain way or
Mm-hmm.
present themselves a certain way or any number of things like that. So much of this film builds towards Paris.
Yes.
So much of your book is about Paris. So much of fashion is about Paris. So much of America is about Paris. We can't talk about American history without Paris.
We need
So I
Paris.
was
Yeah.
wondering, yeah, right. What's the difference between Paris and New York?
Okay. I probably
What's
should
with
have
this
started out with
rivalry?
this because it's important. Okay. So the
Go
French
for it.
legend, this idea
Yes.
that the French are better at fashion and French fashion's better. I also did want to talk about in the book, and one chapter is about that, is that this didn't just happen. It's not that the French just happened to be so good at fashion. This was a policy that was thought out and put into place by Louis XIV. This is back in the 17th century, and his first minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Um, when Louis XIV came to the throne, when he was a little kid when he came to the throne, let's fast forward a few decades to when he can actually make his own decisions. France was not a global luxury leader. People didn't talk about French fashion. They talked about Italian fashion. But he decided that the way to make France great was to capitalize on this. So he and Colbert turned France into the world's first global luxury brand. And Colbert is alleged to have said that luxury would be to France what the gold mines of Peru are to Spain, like the source of untold riches. And they very carefully put this into place by bringing artisans. They hired them away from all over Europe. Like the best silk weavers are from Italy. Come to Paris. We're going to build you a special factory and you can weave silk here. They did this with all these industries, not just fashion, like home furnishings, ceramics, mirrors, everything. And they were really understood the power of marketing. They let everybody know that this was the case. In the silk weavings, for example, they mandated that they had to update their patterns on a regular basis, which is where we get the idea of fashion seasons. They used sex to sell things. It all goes back to the 17th century and the court of Louis XIV. And he loved fashion. He required everyone around him to be perfectly dressed at all times. The French aristocracy were bankrupting themselves to keep up with Louis. So it didn't come out of nowhere. It's not that the French are just so good at fashion. They've built this industry. And as long as we keep believing that about Paris, Paris is going to have that role in fashion. Now, the French designers, I'm using the term designer, but really they're haute couturiers. The collections they design, they make one dress at a time for one woman. And she comes in for a minimum of 3 fittings. It's fitted exactly to her body. If one of her shoulders sits a little bit lower than the other, they're going to correct that. They're going to make it look even. They're going to give her more of a waist if she needs, like whatever it is she needs. It's made for her. This is very expensive. It's not an incredibly practical way to make clothing, but this is how it worked. American designers make ready to wear. There are no fittings. It's like what we have now. You go to the store, you take your size 6 or 12 or 18 or whatever you are off the rack, and that's it. You don't have fittings unless you want to go and have something tailored. But the disconnect in the industry up until the war was that designers and buyers would go to Paris and they'd buy clothes from the couturiers, which they would then copy for the ready-to-wear market. This made no sense, really, because an haute couture dress is like incredibly complicated. The pattern might have like 50 pieces in it. You can't make ready to wear that way. It's not cost efficient. But they would have to figure out a way to translate these patterns to ready to wear. And that's what American women then got to buy. This was so baked into the American system that when the Nazis invaded Paris and essentially put a bell jar over the city, like it's very hard for us to grasp this now with, social media, but they can completely control the information, the flow of information going out of Paris and coming in. The American fashion industry, Seventh Avenue, people freaked out. It was like their hair was on fire. Like what are we going to do? We don't have anything to copy. What are people going to buy in September? They were kind of losing their minds. Not everyone. The empresses were not losing their minds. They knew that American designers could pick up the slack. And so suddenly American designers are put in the position of they don't have anyone to copy. They've got to do it all on their own. And as Lois Long said, you would have thought we were going to be reduced to wearing muumuus the way people were carrying on. She also said that American designers they didn't like being copyists. They wanted to be able to do their own thing. And I can't stress enough how audacious it was for them to say, you know what? New York is not just a manufacturing center. It is a design center. And within 4 years, they turned New York City into a fashion capital. And so there's been that tension between New York and Paris ever since, because then, of course, Paris is liberated. The designers are back in the mix. They're like, hang on, you need to come back to us and buy our clothes. And they did. People did go back to buy because the allure of Paris. I mean, who wants to? It's, Americans in Paris. Americans love Paris. So they did go back and buy. But then there was this alternative of American ready-to-wear, which just made a lot more sense for American lifestyles.
So as I was reading this, I kept thinking about the parallels to the American wine industry.
Good.
That really,
good analogy.
That really, it really emerges. Only out of California, say, instead of New York.
Another good film. Another great film. I forget what it's called, but you know the one I'm referring to.
Bottle Shock.
Yes.
Yeah. Terrific book called Judgment of Paris. It was when I was first.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know this book? Oh my gosh. When my late father-in-law was he got me into wine. And so I started reading about wine. It really just became this thing where it's like, oh wait, the cool thing about wine is that you can share stories about it. And I think maybe there's some parallels there about fashion. It's the stories we tell about it, right? Yeah. And that you get to share it with people. We're talking about New York and Paris. Are there other cities globally that are pushing fashion that are these other, we look at wine.
Yeah.
There's other places now. We think about Argentina with their Malbecs,
right.
Or, even Australia, some of the other stuff. Are there other cities for fashion too that are pushing the needle here and there, or are these the two?
It's always going to be Paris because no one's going to stop believing in the French legend. It's just too good. Okay. New York, people are, every New York Fashion Week rolls around, especially the one in September when everyone comes back, from the summer. Mm-hmm. And there's always so many people are not showing, or so-and-so showing in Paris, or there's nobody worth seeing. So there's always this moaning and groaning. I think New York is not getting out of the game. New York is an important fashion city. It's the linchpin of an enormous market. Paris is not going away. Other cities come and go. Copenhagen Fashion Week just ended. And that kind of, the look of what many designers do, this kind of clean minimalism, a bit asexual, it's really influenced a lot of what's happened in fashion over the past few years. For a while, it was Berlin. Everyone was really into Berlin. London is often important, but not always. But it's regarded as a center of creativity. The designers who are making the jackets with 3 sleeves, that kind of thing. Central St. Martin's is a very well-respected fashion design school. It's graduated so many influential designers. Alexander McQueen, John Galliano, Stella McCartney, Phoebe Philo, the list just goes on and on. So I think other cities, and Milan, of course, how could I leave Milan out? It's a very important center and was built on ready-to-wear because the Italian fashion industry really established itself after World War II with a lot of funds from the Marshall Plan. So it was built on the American model. Ready-to-wear was important.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting to think about because you think about Milan as this old city.
Yeah.
And then in some ways it's very much a new city when it comes to fashion.
Yeah. It was a renowned textile center. And of course, there were dressmakers in Milan who copied Paris like everybody else did. But the idea of Italian designers is not something you hear about before the war. It's afterwards.
See, now all I want to do is get on a plane and go have my Pretty Woman scene where I go to each one of these cities and I get to pick out the good clothes. Or I won't pick out. Someone else will pick out for me what looks, because I'm wearing a brown. You were talking earlier about the browns. I'm like, my shirt is khaki. do you have favorite parts of this film? Things that really kind of speak to you, as you've got all this experience
Yeah. I mean,
watching this. Were there moments?
there are moments that I was very nostalgic about, and not
Tell me.
necessarily in a good way. Like watching, like I thought, wow, did we walk around in high heels all the time? Yes, yes, we did. The banter in the office is very funny. I love those scenes; they're very good. The run throughs, all of that is familiar to me, so it's very fun to watch it. It's hard to put my finger on just one. I think all of the office scenes I really like. I get into it. I identify.
I watch this now and go, Emily Blunt is about to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Right?
That's
Mm-hmm.
right. I mean, this was really her, at least for American audiences. I think this was where she started to arrive. Am I correct?
I think it was a
Uh,
breakout role for her. And apparently the character was supposed to be American. And she said, this girl's British. I could do the accent, but this girl is British.
she's terrific.
She's
I'm a huge
fantastic.
fan of her work.
Yeah.
I'm a big yeah. Are the parts of this film that drive you nuts looking back when you went back to rewatch it? Were you like any nails on the
Well,
chalkboard?
you know what I found irritating? The whole gratuitous affair with the freelance writer. What's his name?
Simon
Christian.
Baker's character.
Yeah, Christian. Yeah, that just seemed like it just feeds into this whole narrative that women are supposed to use their sexuality to get ahead, and also he's such a tool. He really irritated me.
Isn't he a giant tool in this film? And
He's a
then like
self-involved
you
jerk.
know so much where he's constantly teasing her about the boyfriend. Oh, le
Mhm.
boyfriend and blah blah blah. I'm
Mhm.
like, I hate you. He's in LA Confidential. He gets killed in that one. I was kind of hoping that would happen in this one.
No, he doesn't die in this one, but I think his career kind of goes into a tailspin. Anything else?
Someone drops a house on him.
Something.
Yeah,
There were all her circle of friends who just don't get people, and like why are you doing this? Why are you like putting so much
sure.
effort into this? That rang true for me because I think people in fashion often get that reaction, like you're smart. Why do you work in fashion? Which is really an insulting thing to say. That rang true for me. And I
I
know people
wonder
really hate
if this
Nate
is an
as
is
well. People really hate the Nate, the boyfriend, the Adrian Grenier character. Eh,
really.
yeah, people seem to really
You know,
dislike him.
they're in their 20s. They're not going to last. He's
That's
going to go off and be in the Bear sometime.
yeah.
It's
He's gonna show
fine.
up on another show.
Uh,
Yeah.
I did like actually, because they part as friends at the end. I'm like, oh
They
well,
do.
that's at least an adult thing.
That's
Good
quite
for him. That he's
mature
going off to Boston.
for a couple in their 20s. Yeah, that was pretty good.
Yeah, I find myself people just block the phone and you're good to go.
Yeah.
Now, so all right, I want to ask you: do you have a favorite quote from this film? Thinking about this,
Welcome to the dollhouse, baby. That's my favorite. Yeah, that's Nigel. He says that to Andy at the start.
How have we gotten this far into this pod and not talked about Stanley Tucci?
How can we not have talked about Nigel? Although when he talks to her, he has the other scene that talks about the importance of fashion. Miranda Priestley's talking about the
Yes.
economics, and he's talking about how fashion inspires people. And if you're in a family of 6 boys in New Jersey, and I thought, wait a minute, is your name really Nigel, or did you change it? Because that doesn't ring true with the biographical information that you're giving us there. It could be, but it doesn't sound right.
Yeah, I have you seen his whole thing now where he's got this whole social media presence now and the
Mm-hmm.
show. It's like everybody wants to be Stanley Tucci. Like he's become this other he's and he's really likable in this
He's
film.
very
Like we're talking
likable.
about like yeah, I
Yeah,
liked it a lot.
he did that whole series of in Italy where he's just eating. Really, that was wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a rough life for him being in all of these
Yeah,
films and having this life where he's just like, "Hi, I'm going to travel around." He's I guess he's our Bourdain now at this point in time.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
great.
That's a good point.
All right, you wrote this amazing book. You've been writing for a long time. Are there works that have influenced your own work as you've developed and as you were
Mm.
creating this? Were there stuff that you were drawing upon?
When I was writing Empresses, well, fashion is
Yes.
spinach is always in playing in the background in my head because it was just so honest. This is Elizabeth Hawes' book. It was published in 1938. It was actually a New York Times bestseller. Wow. But she was so honest, and she just told it like it was, which didn't make her too popular in the industry. WWD gave her this review that it said something like, well, some people like spinach. It sounded a little ominous. So I always think of that. There is a great biography of Carmel Snow. We didn't even really talk about the rivalry between Carmel Snow and Edna Woolman Chase. Anyway, biography.
No, and I literally wrote her down on my notepad. Go on.
That's by Penelope Rollins. That's a great book. And a book that I don't know if it influenced me, but I read it a lot. It's called American Fashion. It came out in the 70s, and it was edited by a former Vogue editor named Sarah Tomerlin Lee. And it's maybe 5 biographies of American designers, and it really gave them like the star treatment. Yeah.
Awesome. I'll get this up on the show notes a little bit later. I have maybe our final question for you on this pod. You've written this amazing history of women in fashion, and I'm just falling head over heels into this like world that I did not really know existed till a couple of years ago, about thinking about like and I find myself lecturing my son about like what he wears and why it's important, because how you carry yourself and all these different things. Is The Devil Wears Prada a history movie?
I think it represents a particular era in New York fashion publishing. Yes, I think it is. They got a lot of things right. Hollywood does not often get fashion right. They don't understand what motivates fashion people. They just don't get it right. But I think The Devil Wears Prada was really smart. It could have just been like a revenge film, like Miranda's this awful boss, which is why we can all relate to it. Everyone's had a boss like that, whether, when you were a teenager or older, everyone's had an unreasonable boss. But it shows you Miranda's humanity, what drives her. And she has, it's not like she's just randomly evil. She really believes in runway, and she'll sacrifice anything for it, including her friendships. Where was I going with this? Yes, it was a moment when, I was looking at this and I thought so much has changed since then. Now fashion is dominated by these luxury conglomerates like LVMH and the Kering Group. Those didn't really exist then. LVMH owns Dior and Celine and Givenchy and Fendi and Louis Vuitton and Loewe and Tiffany. And Kering owns Balenciaga, Gucci, Saint Laurent, Alexander McQueen. Like they're all grouped into these 2 companies. That was starting them, but it wasn't like the incredible international huge revenue drivers. The head of LVMH, Bernard Arnault, is one of the richest men in the world. He's the richest man in Europe. Fashion is a huge business now. But I do think it covers, it gets that particular moment when magazines were still so important. They're about to fall off a cliff, but nobody realizes yet that that's going to happen. I've heard that in the sequel, the Emily character is now an executive at one of these luxury conglomerates, and Miranda is in a different position now. She needs her advertising dollars. So things have really changed.
Yeah, I really, really want the sequel to happen, especially after watching this. I'm like, this movie is now almost 20 years old.
Yeah.
By the time the sequel gets out, it's 20 years. I mean, it's time to follow up on this story to see where this goes. Right? I mean, that 20 years in fashion, I have to imagine is like a millennia at some point in time. But no, this was amazing. Nancy, this, I have to tell you, I told you that when we started this, this book, and talk about this movie, but like introduced me to this world that I really didn't have an appreciation for. You kind of talked a little bit a few moments ago about how her friends didn't have an appreciation for the work that she was doing and stuff like that. And watching this, and then like you give us this like amazing story of these women and this world, and I thank you for writing this, because I'm so happy to talk to you about this today. This has been amazing. No, you could. This is so awesome. So, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I've had a blast.
For asking me.
You can be. This is amazing. So, we'll get this up in a couple of weeks and have everybody try to read this book as fast as we can. Because this is awesome.
Thank you so much. This has been really fun.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Everybody, that episode was a lot of fun. If you are enjoying the HATM podcast, you're enjoying what we're trying to do, the conversations that we're having, make sure you like and subscribe right down below. If you want to support HATM, you want to support Historians to the Movies and allow us to do even more kinds of things, you can do so by subscribing and donating at the Patreon below. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Talk to you later.